Hello, hello. Welcome to what I think is week 6 of these remote lessons. I'm going to move on to Blood Brothers for this week. I thought it'd be good to kind of keep shifting between the literature texts because I want to teach you some sort of big ideas about how we write about literature as well as revising the individual text, so that when you come back to school, you're going to be able to move on to the next phase of learning, having lots of really secure elements that you can build on with your teachers. So, first of all, the key thing before we move on to Blood Brothers, I just want to reiterate something we did last week. The big thing I wanted you to learn, or to consolidate your understanding of, was themes. Because if you understand what themes are and how themes work within literature, your ability to write about text becomes so much better. And I basically said to you that I want you to think of themes as having 4 elements to it. So when we're talking about understanding the themes or analysing the themes, we're talking about being able to identify what the topics of the text are. In the case of A Christmas Carol, the topics of the book. What is it about? But obviously I then said to you that actually that's not enough. If you can identify the topics of the book, you also need to be able to identify the messages related to those topics. So what is actually the writer trying to say about each of those topics? The third element is then what we call context. How do those messages relate to the real world? What was going on in the real world that kind of impacted upon those messages? And then going even bigger, how are these messages universal? And by universal, I mean that they aren't specific to one set time period. So sometimes we call things universal because they're actually about fundamentals of what it is to be a human being, of why we behave in the way we do, rather than being time specific or culture specific. Okay? So we use this approach, this 4 box effect for Christmas Carol. We identified the topics of the book, the big things it's about, we identified the messages and how those messages related to the real world, and started to think about, with some of them, how they relate to aspects of human nature. And I just want to revise and reiterate that before we move on to our next text. So, as you can see here, I've got a version of the grid I just showed you. I've shrunk down the text and the headings. And all I'm going to do, again, this is all about A Christmas Carol at the moment, is I'm just going to revise that by thinking about what I could put in each one. So I'm going to start by just thinking of one topic in the book A Christmas Carol. And the first one that springs to my mind is the big topic, poverty. So I've identified a theme. So I've identified one of the topics of the book is poverty. But of course, that's meaningless unless I know what the big message is. Now, Dickens had some really clear messages about poverty in A Christmas Carol, didn't he? Most notably, the poor are people too. Dickens did not like the way the poor were treated as if they were inferior. Another big message, I think, is that poverty dehumanises, i.e. the kind of fundamental basics of what it is to be a human are taken away from people because poverty makes it kind of reduces your status in society. And I guess as well, this idea that poverty is cruel. It's a terrible hardship, and that poor people should be helped. So we'll add that as well. People deserve help. So you can see how much more in depth we've gone. We've identified that a topic of the book, a theme, is poverty, but actually we've got some key messages coming through about that topic. How are those messages related to the real world? So that means we just need a little bit of historical background here about how that message links to the world. And obviously it's, for poverty, it's the Poor Laws, isn't it? So hopefully you all remember from in class, the Poor Law Amendment Act meant that the rules around helping the poor became much less compassionate. It was decided that the poor needed to be deterred from accessing help from the state. Access to charity and help had to be restricted because it encouraged idleness and laziness. So that led to the creation in turn of the hideousness of the workhouses. If you were living in poverty and you had no way of making money and affording to eat and live, the only option available to you was to go to the workhouse, which were deliberately harsh and cruel and brutal to deter people from going to them. So these messages we've put up here about poverty and how it's dehumanising and cruel are directly related to the historical period, because Dickens lived through the Poor Laws Amendment Act. He saw the workhouses, he visited the workhouses, and he saw them as places where the poor were being punished rather than helped. So this is perhaps the most complex one then, is the universal themes, how these topics relate to something more fundamental about what it is to be human. And I think really what it comes down to here is maybe ignorance. The fact that those of us who are lucky enough to have enough money to live quite comfortable lives can be quite ignorant to the suffering of others, and can turn our backs on the suffering of others. And that happens to this day, doesn't it? Now, of course, we have much better social systems, support systems for people who are poor. Lots of people want to help other human beings. But actually, we still have, globally, vast poverty. People who live in terrible, terrible poverty and are largely ignored by the wider world and left to struggle. So this idea of our ignorance to the suffering of other humans is what we would call universal, because it's not specific to the 1890s or the 1850s, the Victorian period. It transcends time and culture, this human ability to ignore the suffering of others. Okay, so that's what I mean by themes. I want you to be able to dig down into a theme by doing all 4 strands, to know what the topics are, the big ideas, to know what the messages are, to be able to link that where relevant to the real world, and where relevant, think about how it relates to a more universal experience. So can you please pause the video, and in the same way I just filled in this little sheet, can you do the same for this one? I've identified a topic of the book, which is childhood, which is a topic we explored a lot last week. In this box, can you put down what you think Dickens' big messages are? In this one, how it related to the real world, and in this one, how it relates to a more universal ideas about human nature. So you can obviously rewind this video a bit and go back to my grid as an example, but have a go for this second different theme, trying to put at least something in every box. Okay guys, well done. So just briefly then we'll do a little bit of kind of self-assessment. You can check what you've put. There's no right or wrong answer as such here, but you will like to phrase it slightly differently, as long as you've got the main idea that his message about childhood was that it's a precious time. What is it really? That childhood is precious and important and special, and therefore should be protected. And obviously relates to the last one, that poverty steals childhood. We see children, don't we? We see the Cratchit children. We see ignorance and want, who have had their childhood, the preciousness, that joy of youth, stolen from them. So we've got these key messages that childhood is precious, it should be protected, but poverty steals childhood and forces children to grow up and experience a world that isn't fair. And obviously this relates to the real world. In that time period when Charles Dickens was writing, we have a high child labour rate, lots of children who were lived in very poor families, had to leave, didn't have access to education. By the age of about 10, they're working in factories, they're doing really dangerous jobs, they're climbing chimneys to help clean them, they're running machines in the factories. We see Martha, who obviously is working in a hat shop as an apprentice. And so we see this sense of childhood being stolen as children are forced to grow up is a real aspect of the world. And then, of course, in relation to the aspects of human nature, I think it's very similar to the poverty one. Again, it signals the ignorance, doesn't it, of human nature, our ability to ignore suffering. And that, again, is universal, because although we no longer have these high child labour rates, we no longer send 10-year-olds to work in factories, thank goodness, and you have the right to an education. Actually, that's not the same for children globally. Some children still have childhoods which are very challenging, and sometimes we're willing to ignore the suffering of others. And Dickens's message is very much, isn't it, that we all have a responsibility for each other. We call this social responsibility, that we're not just responsible for ourselves and our immediate family, but we have a social responsibility to to care for others. So that is a message which is specific to his time period, but it's also a universal message because it's still just as relevant to us today. Okay, so let's move away from that now then, and let's move to blood brothers. So what I'd like you to do first of all is to just really get your brains back into blood brothers mode. So what I've put on the screen here is a nice image that I found, which shows our key characters in the play. We've obviously got our central characters, Mickey and Edward. We've got Mrs. Johnston, we've got Linda, and we've got Mrs. Lyons. We've got this dividing line down the middle. We've got the backdrop of buildings, which is the environment of Liverpool. We've got the words working class and middle class. What I'd like you to do, if you have a printer, you could of course print this off, but I think it'd actually be better to sketch it out. It doesn't have to be drawn as well as this. You know I'm terrible at drawing. But just a rough sketch that captures what's on here. Just do it in the middle of the page like I've done, so that around the edge you can annotate all around it everything you can remember. What do you remember about Mickey, Edward, Mrs. Lyons? Why are these words working class and middle class relevant to the play? Why is it relevant that Mrs. Johnston here is dressed as she is and is doing the activity she is? Why is this dividing line coming down the middle? So if you could just try to sketch out the image and then just write all over it in as many notes as you can, as everything you remember about these words and what you know about the characters and context and ideas of the play, I think that would be a brilliant starting point. Probably take you 10 minutes. So pause the video for 10 minutes, get a bit artistic, write loads down, come up with loads of ideas, and then start. Okay guys, now you've had time to do that for, 10 minutes or so by yourself. Can you please dig out your copy of the English Literature Knowledge booklet? Lots of you were given copies way back at the beginning of year 10, which you may or may not still have. If you don't have a copy of it, if you go to Show My Homework, I've uploaded it as a PDF to Show My Homework, so you can look at it on screen. And then can you spend another few minutes flicking through the Blood Brothers section of the knowledge booklet and seeing if there's any more detail you can add, particularly real lines from the play, any particular words that are said by the characters, most important lines. And so take your initial notes that you put, flick through the knowledge booklet, read through the pages and add as much more notes as you can as possible to your little diagram. Okay, so that's it for today. I'm going to leave you with that Blood Brothers revision work to do. And a quick reminder that if you really can't remember the play, then there is a version of it, a school production version of it, but a pretty decent one on YouTube. If you type in Blood Brothers YouTube, it should be one of the top hits that come up. You probably saw it in class. It's by this company, Theatre Inc. 2014. It's just a nice way. It's going to obviously take you a while, but it's a really nice way to revise, isn't it? To spend a little while. Or likewise on YouTube is the full soundtrack, so you could just listen to the soundtrack whilst you're doing some other work today, just to get it fresh back in your brain. So tomorrow we'll start on Blood Brothers a little bit more, but for today I just wanted you to remind yourself of the big ideas, have a look at the knowledge booklet, refresh yourself on the notes, and we'll start it again tomorrow. Thanks guys, bye.